Under a scorching, unyielding sun, Elias Kane's heart pounded as he surveyed the barren remains of his once prosperous ranch. The cracked earth, stripped of all life by a merciless drought, mirrored the emptiness at the core of his soul. Every building stood silent and ruined, relic of the past when laughter and family had filled these now desolate fields. His eyes, dark and haunted, swept across the landscape, searching for hope in the endless dust. It was in that desperate moment of solitude that fate, cruel and unexpected, cast its die. Elias was a widower, years removed from the gentle warmth of his departed wife and children, their memories lingering like ghosts in every weather-bored and sun-scorched corner of his land. He had long resigned himself to a life of isolation and endless toil, haunted by loss and bound by duty to maintain the legacy of his family. Yet today, as he trudged along the edge of his once vibrant homestead, a far-off sight set his pulse racing with a mixture of alarm and reluctant hope. In the distance, slowly emerging from the shimmering heat of the desert, was a worn wagon drawn by exhausted horses. Its wheels churned up clouds of dust on a cracked trail, and its sagging canvas roof fluttered weakly in the dry wind. Unlike the stoic vehicles typical of the frontier, this wagon bore an unmistakable sign of distress: a battered wooden crate strapped to its side, and a bound figure visible through a small window. As Elias drew nearer, he realized with a jolt that the figure was that of a woman. She was clearly in torment, her frail form trembling beneath layers of rough cloth, and the gentle curve of a pregnant belly shrouded by her faded dress. Her wrists and ankles were bound with coarse rope, and streaks of blood marred her sun-bleached skin. In that instant, a mix of horror and fierce compassion surged within him. Every instinct in Elias screamed that this was no ordinary wagon ride. Rather, it was a grim procession to an auction, a lawless event where desperate souls were traded like cattle. Black Hollow, a town infamous for its corrupt dealings and ruthless bargains, was hosting this unspeakable sale. With his heart heavy from his own losses, he could not fathom the cruelty of condemning a woman, especially one carrying new life, to such a fate. For a long, agonizing moment, Elias stood frozen on the parched roadside, torn between a relentless pragmatism that kept him alive and a rekindled fire of righteousness that now urged him to act. The heat of the day lent an almost surreal quality to the scene. Dust swirled in erratic patterns, blurring the outlines of distant mesas, and lending an eerie luster to the world. The creaking of the wagon's wheels on sun-baked earth echoed like a death knell, and an oppressive silence enveloped the outskirts of Black Hollow. Elias's mind raced. This was his last chance to redeem himself, perhaps to find a measure of penance for the grief that had defined his life. The burning question gnawed at him. Could he risk everything, his only remaining resources, to rescue a stranger destined to be shattered by cruelty? As the wagon drew near, Elias's weathered face hardened into a mask of grim determination. His hand drifted to the worn grip of his rifle, a relic both of past battles and personal sorrow, and he weighed the sacrifice of his remaining land against the price of human dignity. In that moment, memories of his lost family flashed before his eyes. The way his little daughter's laughter once lightened even the darkest of days, the gentle embrace of his wife that had shielded him from pain. Now, with those echoes urging him forward, he knew he could no longer stand idly by. Navigating his battered truck with the precision of a man who had long learned to trust his instincts, Elias followed the wagon along a dusty trail that twisted toward Black Hollow. The oppressive heat made each mile seem like a trial, and every shift in the wind carried with it the murmur of desperate lives sold to cruelty. As he approached the outskirts of the town, the scene before him grew increasingly grim. A makeshift platform had been erected in the center of a ramshackle square, where eager, hard-eyed buyers and indifferent onlookers milled, their voices low and conspiratorial. Shabby tents and faded banners fluttered haphazardly, setting the stage for an auction where lives were weighed in coin and disregard. Peering through the haze, Elias saw the woman Mara, as he would later learn her name. Her eyes closed as if in resignation, her bound hands trembling in silent protest against the ropes that held her captive. Her figure, fragile and yet unmistakably defiant in the face of her torment, stirred something deep within him. The tender bulge of her pregnant belly spoke of new life, of possibilities that stretched far beyond the barren landscape he knew so well. In the glimmer of that moment, Elias resolved that he could not let this injustice pass unchallenged. The auctioneer's voice, hoarse and grating, rang out in the square, calling for bids with merciless fervor that made the very air quiver with dread. "Step right up, folks. Today, we have a rare opportunity. A young woman, soon-to-be bride, available for the highest bidder." His words, devoid of any conscience, sent chills down the spines of even the most hardened onlookers. But Elias was no onlooker. He was a man who had suffered loss beyond measure, and now he was prepared to risk everything to salvage what little remained of his battered honor. For a heartbeat, time seemed to slow. The world around him blurred into silence as he tightened his grip on the rifle, the weight of his decision settling upon him. He could almost hear the distant echoes of his wife's comforting laugh and his children's playful voices, memories that lent him strength in the face of overwhelming despair. With one determined, swift motion, Elias maneuvered his vehicle to block the narrow street, forcing the wagon to halt abruptly. Shouts rang out as the buyer's murmurs turned to anger and confusion, and in that moment, chaos ignited like a wildfire in the dry prairie. Elias leaped from his truck, rifle raised and eyes blazing with a protective fire. Dodging rockets of curses from the assembled crowd, he charged toward the makeshift stage where Mara was held captive. Every step reverberated with the weight of his resolve, each footfall a defiant rupture in the silence of cruelty. In the ensuing commotion, a mix of startled gasps, the clatter of spooked horses, and the panicked scramble of corrupt onlookers, Elias reached the platform. His voice boomed out as he called for order, challenging the assembled mob and the indifferent auctioneer with the gravitas of a man who reclaimed his own destiny. At that critical juncture, as the chaos swirled in the faces of the greedy and the desperate mingled in flickering torchlight, Elias stared into Mara's eyes. In them, he saw not a broken soul, but a spark of undeniable resilience and potential for redemption. The auctioneer's voice faltered, and for a suspended moment, the lawless crowd was silenced by the magnitude of his intervention. But before Elias could fully secure the rescue, a haunting chill snaked down his spine. The unmistakable murmur of approaching riders was heard in the distance, a forewarning that dark forces were already converging upon Black Hollow. In that beat, a moment when the weight of his choice hung in the balance, Elias knew that the battle for Mara's freedom was only beginning. With the rifles raised and the promise of violence stirring in the air, his decision had been made. In the midst of chaos, with the scorching sun beating down upon a town steeped in corruption, Elias Kane resolved that he would face whatever horrors lay ahead. He would not allow the vulnerable life before him to be traded like a commodity, even if it meant sacrificing his last remaining land. His own battered soul would be offered as ransom for the honor and dignity that belonged to both of them. As the distant sound of hooves grew louder and the tension in the air became nearly unbearable, Elias tightened his grip on his rifle. His eyes, hardened by loss yet glimmering with newfound purpose, locked onto Mara's, silently promising, "I'll save you, no matter the cost." And with that, the fate of a struggling widower and the doomed yet defiant bride-to-be was sealed in a single, decisive moment, one that would echo through the desolate lands of Black Hollow and beyond. With the approaching riders pressing closer, Elias stands, rifle in hand, on the cusp of an impossible rescue. The chaos of the auction square in Black Hollow escalated as the thunder of hooves and the shouted curses of onlookers merged under a blood-red sunset. The corrupt sheriff, draped in a stained duster and flanked by men with cruel eyes, had already begun calling out bids with a sneer. Yet just as the auctioneer's abrasive voice carried over the square announcing the start of the sale, a commotion erupted at the edge of the platform. From the swirling dust, a far-off rumble announced the arrival of riders. The tense, lawless spirit of the town seemed to shudder as a cadre of mounted desperadoes, clearly members of the notorious Iron Wolves, hurtled into view with torches flickering and boots kicking up clouds in the twilight. Elias Kane, his soul weighed down by grief and hardened by years of solitude, stood rooted among crude stalls and patched tarps, his eyes dark and resolute, locked on the wagon that carried Mara, the bound, bleeding, heavily pregnant woman whose sorrowful gaze cut to the haze of greed. For a moment, the auction halted. The corrupt sheriff and the auctioneer paused, miffed at this unexpected disturbance. But Elias would not let the moment slip. With grim calculation, he stepped forward and declared, his voice louder than the tumult, that he would place a bid for Mara, one that would cost him every last acre he possessed. In a voice trembling with both indignation and a rekindled hope, he shouted, "I bid my 50 acres, everything I own, if it will see her freed." The words, cool and determined, struck the air like a gauntlet thrown at the feet of corruption. The crowd fell into an uneasy murmur. The sheriff's eyes widened in disbelief behind his crooked smile, while the auctioneer sputtered, momentarily faltering under Elias's challenge. In that volatile moment, as the riders' torches cast leaping shadows across the muddied street, Elias strode onto the platform. His strong, callous hand clutched the worn grip of his rifle, and his eyes burned with protective fury that had been dormant for far too long. Without waiting for further call to order, he reached Mara, who cowered at the center of the stage, her wrists bleeding from tight, blood-streaked ropes that had marked her as a trophy. With deliberate urgency, Elias untied the knots as the corrupt officials shouted derision and threats. In a hushed, almost reverent tone, he murmured to Mara, "You are free now." Before the auctioneer could recover his voice, chaos fully broke out. The approaching riders, the Iron Wolf scouts, had reached the fringes of the square, their harsh whistles and shouted commands mixing with the rising tumult of frightened townsfolk. In the midst of the confusion, the sheriff barked order for order and attempted to seize Elias. But in the bedlam, Elias used every tactic he'd learned in his years of hardship to fend off the lawless enforcers. With swift, determined motions, he pulled Mara away from the auction platform as a cloud of dust and curses erupted behind them. The street filled with frantic shouts, and in the ensuing melee, the sheriff's men struggled to regain control, while the auctioneer's desperate cries faded into cacophony. Elias, his heart pounding like a war drum, ushered Mara toward the exit. As they moved swiftly along the narrow, winding alleyways of Black Hollow, the scent of sweat, old leather, and despair hung in the air. The dying light of dusk rendered everything in hues of red and gold, contrasting with the grim determination in Elias's eyes. "In the shadow of their chains, I carry a debt that demands blood," he whispered, his voice low and fierce as if to reassure himself as much as Mara that justice would come. Mara's eyes, glazed with both gratitude and lingering terror, barely met his as she nodded, her heart heavy with memories of bondage and brutality. They slipped through the winding back streets and dusty passages out of the auction square, each footstep echoing like a heartbeat in the looming silence. The sound of approaching hooves and the angry shouts of men behind them urged the pair to move faster. Every so often, a gust of wind stirred up swirling dust clouds that hid their desperate flight, yet also carried the acrid scent of spilled blood and regret. The fading light soon gave way to a twilight shroud as they reached the outskirts of town, where the air was cooler and the lurking threat of the Iron Wolves felt momentarily at bay. At a deserted crossroads, Elias halted, his gaze darting to a lean, beaten signpost that read Black Hollow, 50 miles. With no time to spare, he turned to Mara. "We ride now," he urged, his tone leaving no room for hesitation. "I'll place your freedom above my last possession, but we must not look back." Mara, though visibly trembling with fear and pain, managed a nod. Her strained voice, barely audible, murmured, "I owe you more than words. I was once captive to the Iron Wolves. They forced me into this, forced me to bear a child for their own twisted gain." Her admission cut deeply through the chill of the dusk, and Elias felt a renewed surge of protective resolve. The horrors of her past now melded with his own, creating a bond built on shared suffering and a common enemy. Without further delay, Elias mounted his horse and gently helped Mara climb onto his back. Together, they spurred off down a narrow dirt road that wound between low scrub and towering juniper trees. The once vivacious town of Black Hollow faded into the distance behind them, swallowed by the gathering gloom. Yet the reprieve was short-lived. A sense of undeniable foreboding clung to the air. The distant sound of hooves, now more insistent and coordinated, warned of an unyielding pursuit. Shadows flitted across the twilight horizon as Laura, a fleeting silhouette in the gathering darkness, signaled that the Iron Wolves scouts had caught their trail. Caleb's mind whirled with the stakes of their desperate escape. The remnants of the auction and the broken shouts of the corrupt sheriff echoed faintly in his ears, but now only the relentless rhythm of hooves and the surging pulse of adrenaline mattered. Mara's recent revelation, that she had been forced into pregnancy by the gang's merciless leader, haunted the space between them. Her confession added a new level of urgency. The ruthless Iron Wolves would stop at nothing to reclaim her and punish her for her defiance. As their horses rolled over the parched terrain under a twilight sky, every sun-bleached stone and whispering wind confirmed the peril of their flight. Elias glanced sideways at Mara. Her face, though marred by recent trauma, burned with a quiet, determined fire. The memory of her long years in captivity, of being confined, beaten, and forced, spurred him to fight with an intensity he had thought he had long lost. "I'm going to protect you," he said firmly, the weight of his words matching the gravity of his sacrifice. "But know this, any harm that comes to you will be repaid in blood." His declaration, simple and raw, resonated with the harsh reality of their world, a world where every ounce of strength was measured in survival, and the scars of the past demanded retribution. They pressed onward over rugged trails where the twilight deepened into a bruise-colored night, and the stars began to shimmer faintly through stretching clouds. The rugged landscape shifted beneath them. Dusty ridges, wind-swept plains, and the enduring silence of the frontier became their only companions. Yet even as they rode, the threat grew closer. The distant clatter of hooves merged with the swirling dust, and the unmistakable formations of riders emerged on the horizon, like predators closing in on their prey. With hearts pounding in unison, Elias and Mara exchanged one final glance before spurring onward into the uncertain dark. Their escape was far from over. Every shadow, every whisper of wind, and every distant hoofbeat promised that the Iron Wolves were not only hunting them, they were closing in on the very path they traveled. In that moment, as the last vestiges of dusk melted into impenetrable night, the figures of riders could be seen emerging steadily, their silhouettes a grim and relentless threat against the deepening sky. The tension in the air was palpable as the sound of hooves grew louder and more synchronized. Elias leaned forward, eyes fixed on the narrowing gap between them and the approaching riders. Mara clutched him tightly, her body trembling, the chilling memory of her torment mingling with desperate hope. The bitter wind seemed to carry their fear across the barren land. Every fiber of their being screamed that the pursuit was imminent, that the cruel Iron Wolves would soon overtake their flight. And then, just as the horizon darkened with the approaching menace, a cold, steady sound of horses drew nearer. In the distance, among the swirling clouds of dust and the ghostly glow of torchlight, a line of riders emerged. Their forms were sharp and menacing, and their eyes gleamed with ruthless purpose. It was in that rising moment, as the night itself seemed to hold its breath, that Elias knew with grim certainty that their trail had been spotted. The Iron Wolves scouts were closing in, and the promise of a ruthless confrontation now loomed larger than ever. As the shadows of the approaching scouts grow long in the twilight, Elias and Mara braced themselves for what comes next. The twilight was deepening into a bruised dusk as Elias and Mara neared the jagged entrance of a narrow canyon, the rugged walls standing as silent sentinels against the fading light. Just as they reached the rocky threshold, the air exploded with the sound of boots and raised voices. Out of the swirling desert dust emerged a small band of Iron Wolf scouts, their sneers illuminated by the weak light of dusk. The scouts moved with ruthless precision, intent on ambushing anyone daring to escape Black Hollow. Elias reacted instantly. His instincts, honed by years of loss and hardship, allowed him little hesitation. With a fierce glare, he raised his rifle and dove behind a large boulder jutting from the canyon's mouth, pulling Mara close with him. The scout's shouts ricocheted off the stone walls while heated voices called, "Stop them! or we'll have more than our share of trouble." Gunfire erupted in a staccato burst, and the rocky ground trembled as bullets whizzed past. Dust swirled in chaotic eddies around them, blending with the acrid scent of smoke and fear. A bullet whined past Elias's ear, forcing him to snap his head to the side. In that fleeting moment, he caught sight of Mara's eyes, wide, fearful yet steadfast. Determined not to let his newfound charge be recaptured by these relentless foes, Elias signaled to her silently and then surged toward a narrow gap between two large rock faces. The scouts, momentarily disoriented by the sudden movement, fired wildly into the darkening air. Their shouts mixed with the echo of gunfire as Elias and Mara dashed into canyon shelter. The rocky corridor swallowed them whole. In the claustrophobic recesses of the canyon, their footsteps echoed on the loose gravel and worn stone, every sound magnified in the storm of chaos behind them. After a desperate sprint along the rugged trail, the pair finally emerged into a hidden alcove, a secluded nook in the canyon where the wind died down and the roar of the outside world softened to a distant murmur. There, leaning against a weathered boulder that jutted from the canyon wall, stood an unexpected figure. Clad in a threadbare coat and with sharp eyes that flickered with cautious scrutiny, the man introduced himself in a gravelly voice as Gideon, a reclusive trapper who had long sought refuge in these remote crags. "You too looking for shelter from more than just a storm," he said, his tone laced with both wariness and a begrudging compassion. "This here cave has served me well for more years than I care to admit. You're welcome to rest, but be warned, the Iron Wolves aren't ones to forget or forgive." Caleb, still panting from the frantic escape, nodded his gratitude as he helped Mara down from the small ledge. The hidden cave was modest but secure, its entrance obscured by overhanging rock and brush. Inside, the air was cool and still despite the raging storm outside, and the rough stone floor bore decades of dust and solitude. As Gideon led them deeper into the cave, he paused to set aside a rough-hewn cot and a small bundle of provisions. "Rest while you can," he advised, his gaze lingering on Mara's blood-stained bandages. "For out there, the night brings more than just cold winds." Once they settled, the temporary safety of the cave allowed a fragile calm to descend. Bereft of immediate danger, Mara's guarded demeanor began to crack. Her voice, soft and quivering, broke the silence as she shared more of her dark past. They were known as the Iron Wolves," she whispered, eyes fixed on a far-off point in the gloom. "I was captured by them when I was barely a girl. Their leader, he was crueler than any devil, forced me into things I wish I could forget." Her tone faltered as memories surged unbidden, and her fingers unconsciously brushed over a faded scar that marked her shoulder. "In the shadow of their chains, I carry a debt that demands blood," she murmured, her words heavy with both regret and a growing resolve. Caleb's steely face softened with empathy as he listened. He had lost so much himself. The weight of his grief was matched only by the burden of his unyielding determination. "We'll see to it that their cruelty ends," he vowed quietly. "I won't stand by while those monsters control your fate, or mine." His words, rugged and sincere, resonated in the hush of the canyons. It was then that Gideon, the solitary trapper, narrowed his eyes and interjected with a rough edge, "I've been watching these desperados from afar. They run their business with fear, but they've got weaknesses. Their hideouts are few and far between, and their men, while vicious, are no match for a well-set trap." His weathered hands moved to the pouch at his belt, revealing a few primitive but effective tools. Spring-loaded snares, bundles of dynamite with crude fuses, and an assortment of sharpened metal scrap. "I know every cranny of this land. In the silence of this canyon, I found a strength to fight their shadows," he said, his voice gruff yet inspiring. Gideon's words brought a spark of hope to the group. Perhaps together they might stand against the Iron Wolves. The night grew deeper, and the storm outside began to subside into a low, relentless drizzle that pelted the cave entrance. In the relative quiet, surreptitious planning took shape. Caleb and Gideon spread out a rough map on a flat stone, marking potential ambush points and escape routes, while Mara listened intently, and occasionally offered details from her own painful recollections. She recounted vivid images of the Iron Wolves' brutal reign. The screams that echoed through cramp-holed cells, the cold, calculating glint in the eyes of their leader as he delivered orders, and the oppressive dread that had once filled her every waking hour. Each memory was a fresh wound, yet with each retelling her voice grew steadier, imbued with a hardened resolve. "I was nothing but a prisoner, but no more," she declared softly, determination lighting her features. "They may have broken my body, but they never broke my spirit." Her statement, resonant with defiance, mingled with the murmur of the dripping cave and the distant howling wind. Gideon, listening intently, nodded his approval. "They think fear is might," he spat out. "But the truth is, in numbers and in cunning, we can turn that fear right back on them." Caleb's eyes met Gideon's in silent understanding. They knew that their survival and the chance to dismantle the Iron Wolves' tyranny depended on unity and careful strategy. Over the next hour, the three of them huddled around a flickering lantern, organizing their thoughts, dividing tasks, and mapping out the vulnerabilities of the enemy. Every whispered word was laden with both risk and hope, a precarious balance of survival instincts and the slow, burning laughter of vengeance. Yet even in that tentative safety, a chill ran down Caleb's spine as he peered out through a narrow slit in the cave wall. In the distance, under a brooding and storm-torn sky, he could just make out the intermittent glow of torches and the ominous clatter of horses on rugged ground. Shadows danced along the canyon's edge, and every so often, the faint echo of human voices carried on the wind, a stark reminder that the Iron Wolves were persistent and ruthless. The tension in the cave grew palpably heavy as the trio realized that the enemy was closing in on their sanctuary. Gideon's voice broke the silence. "We bought ourselves a moment of respite, but it won't last long," he warned gravely. "They'll find a way sooner or later." Caleb's jaw tightened as he clenched his fist, the weight of responsibility settling squarely on his broad shoulders. Mara, too, appeared steeled by the dawning prospect of the approaching threat. Her eyes, though shadowed with past pain, now shone with defiant resolve. "In the silence of this canyon, I found a strength to fight their shadows," she repeated softly, as if reaffirming a personal oath. It was a promise to herself and to all who had suffered under the cruel hand of the Iron Wolves. As the trio finalized their plan for a counterstrike, the sound of movement grew louder outside. The scouts, they had been so elusive, now began to gather the canyon entrance, their torches flickering like malevolent beacons against the encroaching dark. The sound of hushed, sinister murmurs and the rhythmic clatter of hooves resonated in the distance. In that charged moment, with the storm's fury receding into a deceptive calm, vulnerability warred with resolve. Caleb's grip tightened on his rifle as he prepared himself mentally and physically for what was to come. The hidden sanctuary, now a fragile bastion against overwhelming odds, ended its brief calm with the inevitable intrusion of the enemy's approach. At the precise moment when hope and despair mingled in the damp air, a lone torch flickered at the canyon's mouth, a silent, ominous signal that the Iron Wolves had discovered their hideout. The sound of approaching footsteps and the low murmur of enemies grew steadily more distinct, with their hearts pounding in unison and the flickering torchlight casting long, uncertain shadows on the rough stone walls. Caleb, Mara, and Gideon braced themselves for what would be the next hour of relentless confrontation. The torches of the Iron Wolves now flared at the canyon entrance, their menacing glow heralding the imminent invasion. The scouts of the Iron Wolves had not yet left the canyon entrance when the tension inside the hidden refuge became palpable. Outside, the distant murmur of boots and hushed orders echoed along the rugged walls as the gang's lookouts, torches held high, began probing every crevice as if determined to flush out intruders. Inside the secluded alcove, Elias Kane, Mara, and the reclusive trapper Gideon moved with deliberate caution. They had spent the last few anxious hours rigging traps and reinforcing makeshift defenses. Rough ropes were strung across narrow passes, and crude caltrops were scattered in the dusty ground. Every sound in the fading light was magnified, a soft creak of shifting stone, the drip of water from the cave's ceiling. Even the whisper of the wind seemed to threaten the fragile peace of their sanctuary. Elias's eyes, hard and calculating, darted between the dark entrance and the small circle where they huddled. "Stay low and keep silent," he murmured, his voice barely rising above the low rumble of the gathering storm outside. Even as the scouts' flickering torchlight danced on the canyon walls, they managed to repel the probing attempts with well-set obstacles. Gideon's own tools, a collection of sharpened scrap metal and hastily prepared dynamite charges, had already sent a couple of the enemy's men scattering in pain and confusion. The defenders' makeshift barricades, though humble, held their ground against the initial assault, providing a brief, hard-won respite. Despite their victory, every heartbeat carried the clear knowledge that this was only the beginning. Deeper within the darkness, the threat still loomed like a specter waiting to strike. Seizing the moment of fragile calm, the three allies gathered around a flickering lantern as rain began to patter against the canyon rock. Their plan now turned from mere survival to a daring counterstrike. Elias, his gaze steady and voice resolute, laid out the covert operation they would undertake, a raid on the Iron Wolves' nearby camp. "We need to steal the evidence," he said, tapping on a roughly drawn map carved in the dirt, the letters and ledgers that expose every sordid detail of their crimes. "That proof will turn the tide against them." Gideon interjected with his characteristic gruff certainty. "Their camp is lightly guarded during the dead of night. With a little luck and proper timing, we can slip in and out before they even know we were there." Mara listened intently, her eyes darkening with memories and pain. In a hushed tone, she revealed more of her traumatic past to the small group. "I was once their prisoner," she confessed, voice trembling as she recounted the cruelty of the Iron Wolves. "And their leader, he made me endure horrors so deep that I thought I would never be free of them. In the echo of my shame, I found the will to defy him." Her words, raw and laden with anguish, were met with heavy silence. Yet, amid the despair, there was a spark of hope, a determination to seize back control over her own shattered destiny. They all knew that the evidence would not only expose the gang's crimes, but also rally support from the scattered, lawless communities that had suffered under their reign. Under the cloak of a deepening storm, the trio set out from their canyon refuge. The rain fell in heavy sheets, blurring the edges of the rugged landscape as they made their way through a narrow, winding trail toward the Iron Wolves' illicit camp. The path was treacherous, the ground slick with mud and dotted with obstacles, but the darkness provided perfect cover. Gideon, familiar with every hidden turn in these parts, led the way with a quiet confidence that reassured his companions. Soon, they reached the outskirts of the gang's encampment, a makeshift camp of tattered tents and crude wooden structures, where the ruthless Iron Wolves held their secret meetings and stored their ill-gotten gains. The flicker of oil lamps and scattered bonfires created a ghostly panorama against the stormy night, and the group paused behind a ridge of jagged rock to assess their target. Elias's voice was barely above a whisper as he outlined the plan. "We need to get in, locate the evidence, letters, ledgers, whatever shows their crimes, and get out before they're fully awake," he said, eyes narrowing at the distant shapes of vigilant guards moving slowly about the camp. The sound of the rain and occasional distant thunder masked their cautious footsteps as they inched closer to a barely lit storage shed. Within that shed, piled among old crates and oil barrels, lay documents that, if taken, could shatter the Iron Wolves' grip on these lands. As they crept across the muddy ground, the tension was almost suffocating. Every snap of a twig and every gust of wind set their hearts racing. They reached the shed, and Elias signaled for Mara and Gideon to cover him while he slipped inside. Inside the dimly lit shed, Elias found scattered papers and several heavy ledgers bound in worn leather. He quickly scanned the documents. Cruel orders, illicit deals, and damning evidence of corruption lay scribbled within. Carefully, he gathered the most incriminating letters and ledgers, stuffing them into a leather satchel. Outside, however, the enemy was not idle. The soft murmur of voices reached their ears, a patrol of Iron Wolves riding along the camp's perimeter. At that moment, a sudden flash of lightning illuminated the encampment, and with it came a loud, harsh shout. The covert raid had been discovered. Elias, heart pounding with urgency, retreated from the shed as silently as he had entered. Back on the trail, the group hastened their pace, the storm now intensifying around them. The stolen evidence in Elias's satchel was their ticket to retribution, but every step towards safety was fraught with peril. As they rode back toward the canyon, Mara's mind involuntarily recoiled from the images of her captivity, the anguished screams of her lost brother, the cold, dismissive cruelty of the gang leader. The memory overwhelmed her, and she faltered under the weight of her trauma. "In the echo of my shame, I found the will to defy him," she repeated, voice quivering as fresh tears mingled with the rain. Elias stopped his horse abruptly beside her, gently taking her hand. "We will overcome this," he assured her, a firm promise in his tone. "We're not just running. We're building the foundation of our redemption." His words, resolute and reassuring, helped guide her through the dark recesses of her memories as they pressed on. Bound by newly forged trust and armed with evidence that could bring down the iron wolves, they finally reached the relative safety of the canyon. The hidden sanctuary, though still precarious, offered temporary refuge as they regrouped with Gideon and their small band of allies. Plans were hastily redrawn around rough-hewn maps, and the stolen documents were laid out for all to see, their damning signatures promising to ignite a spark of revolution in the corrupt frontier. But then, as if summoned by the very storm, a distant rumble of approaching riders filled the canyon once more. The soft glow of torches emerged at the canyon's mouth, ominous beacons that foretold the imminent arrival of the full Iron Wolves force. In that charged moment, as the wind whipped violent swirls of dust against weathered stone and the stolen evidence weighed heavily in Elias's satchel, the fragile sanctuary was thrown into grave uncertainty. The defenders barely had time to catch a breath before the first echoes of enemy gunfire began to pierce the stillness of the stormy night. The battle for their lives and for justice was about to be reignited with savage ferocity. Amid bolts of lightning and the rising cacophony of battle, the Iron Wolves launched a full assault on the canyon, their gunfire erupting in the night. The storm's fury reached its zenith as the Iron Wolves' full-scale assault exploded into the narrow confines of the canyon. Under a sky split by lightning and pounding rain, the defenders of the hidden refuge braced against a relentless barrage of gunfire and shouted orders. The deafening roar of rifles, the acrid stench of burning wood, and the pounding of enemy hooves melded into a chaotic symphony that shook the very stone walls of the canyon. Elias Kane, standing resolute at the front of the defense, raised his rifle high as shots arced over his head, illuminating the desperation in every determined glance. Mara clutched a blood-stained cloth to her side, while Gideon's steady hands fumbled with an old snare that he had rigged earlier. Every soul in the canyon fought as if their lives, and the future they longed to rebuild, depended on each drawn breath. Amid the swirling dust and lashing rain, gunfire lit the wet stone like sporadic bursts of lightning. The stolen evidence, safely dispatched to the nearby town in the chaos of the earlier raid, had already begun to turn local sentiment against the Iron Wolves. Now, bolstered by that promise of justice, the defenders willed themselves to hold the line at whatever cost. Elias barked orders over the cacophony of the assault, his voice steady despite the storm. "Hold your positions. Do not let them break through." His words were power incarnate, each syllable a reminder that for every life they had lost, vengeance and justice must be exacted. Behind him, the former miners, once hardened by ceaseless toil and loss, manned their improvised barricades with grit and determination. Explosions from timed dynamite charges shattered the enemy's momentum, sending bodies scattering and plunging parts of the canyon into momentary disarray. Gideon, his grizzled face illuminated by the erratic flashes of lightning, moved like a shadow along the canyon wall, rearming traps and ensuring that every possible choke point was fortified. The defenders pushed forward with a fierce unity, each man and woman fighting not just against tyranny, but for the hope of a new beginning. As bullets ricocheted off rock and wooden splinters littered the ground, the defenders proved that even in the heart of the storm, courage could serve as the greatest weapon of all. At the same time, news of the stolen evidence was making its way through the lawless back roads to a nearby frontier town. The incriminating letters and ledgers, exposing unspeakable crimes and the ruthless extortions of the Iron Wolves, began to spark public outrage. Local citizens, tired of living in fear under the gang's oppressive thumb, rallied silently behind these revelations. The corruption of the town's crooked officials was laid bare, and even the most apathetic among the populace stirred with a sense of justice long denied. This turning tide of public sentiment would soon prove to be as pivotal as a physical battle being waged in the canyon. Although the Iron Wolves still fought on with a savage ferocity, the seeds of rebellion had been sown far beyond the canyon's rocky confines. For Caleb and his band, the knowledge that the truth was coming to light fortified their resolve. Every round fired, every desperate cry, was driven by the promise that one day soon the tyranny of the gang would be no more. Amid the chaos, Mara found herself face to face with the embodiment of her nightmares. As enemy reinforcements pressed closer, a lone rider separated from the main force emerged to confront her, a gaunt figure cloaked in the insignia of the Iron Wolves. With a snarl, the gang leader, whose cruelty had haunted every moment of her past, dismounted and advanced with deliberate malice. In the flickering torchlight and under the assault of rain, his eyes burned with a hateful gleam. Mara's body trembled as vivid memories of her captivity surged back, of unspeakable horrors, and the echo of her late brother's screams in the night. For an agonizing moment, despair gripped her heart as the ghost of her past threatened to overwhelm her. But then, fueled by resolve forged in the crucible of suffering, she looked up and met his gaze with unyielding defiance. "In the echo of my shame, I found the will to defy him," she declared, her voice quivering with both pain and an unrelenting desire for retribution. With a swift, desperate motion born of years of pent-up anguish, Mara lunged forward, parrying his advance with strength that stunned even her. The ensuing duel was as brutal as it was swift, a clash of past torment and present vengeance, where every strike was laden with personal grief and the promise of freedom. In the torrential rain, their weapons clashed, sending sparks into the darkened air. And finally, with one decisive cry and a final resolute blow, Mara felled the gang leader, watching as he crumpled to the blood-stained canyon floor, his reign of cruelty brought to a bitter end. With their leader defeated and their momentum shattered by the fierce counterattack, the remaining Iron Wolves faltered. The one savage assault turned into a chaotic retreat, punctuated by desperate shouts and the rapid retreat of enemy boots along the canyon's winding corridors. Elias, Mara, and Gideon, along with their loyal allies, rallied as the invaders were driven back. The stolen evidence, now destined to expose the gang's monstrous deeds, shimmered in Elias's satchel like a beacon of hope amid the carnage. Slowly, as if emerging from a nightmare, the roiling storm began to ease. The thunder's rage subsided into a low, persistent rumble. The torrential rain gave way to a gentle drizzle, and through the dissipating clouds, the first fragile rays of dawn began to pierce the darkened sky. The canyon, once drenched in the fury of gunfire and bloodshed, now lay quiet and scarred, its walls bearing silent testimony to the savagery that unfolded. In the aftermath, the survivors gathered amid the ruined defenses, their faces streaked with grime, sweat, and sorrow. Yet amid their exhaustion and loss, there flickered a resilient spark of hope. Working together, they began the grim task of rebuilding their sanctuary. Rough-hewn planks that had once been shattered by enemy fire were gathered and secured once more, while fallen debris was cleared away to reclaim the sacred space of their haven. Gideon, with arms still calloused from years of hardship, led the effort, his voice gruff but filled with quiet pride as he directed his comrades. "From the ashes of cruelty, we carved a future worth defending," he declared, echoing the shared sentiment of those who had struggled and survived. Elias and Mara stood side by side, their eyes meeting in a silent vow that the bonds forged in battle would lead them to a new life, a life free from the tyranny that had once held them captive. As the new day broke, the dreary remnants of night gave way to the soft pastel hues of early morning. The The storm cloud slowly receded, revealing a vast expanse of light and promise, while the canyon's walls glowed faintly with the blush of sunrise. In that quiet, hopeful dawn, the survivors began to see that, even in the most desolate landscapes, there lay a chance for renewal. With the iron wolves defeated and the truth of their crimes laid bare to a community ready for change, the promise of a better future resonated like a steady heartbeat through the canyon. Elias, burdened by past sorrows yet transformed by the struggle, helped Mara and the weary miners secure their haven. Overcoming unthinkable odds, they had not only defended their lives, but also ignited a spark of justice that would spread beyond the canyon's rugged borders. Mara's eyes, once filled with terror and despair, now shone with the bright embers of hope and the quiet triumph of survival. In that moment of renewal, as the first rays of dawn lit the canyon floor, the survivors knew that they had reclaimed their lives from the treacherous grasp of the past. If this tale of grit and redemption move you, subscribe for more Wild West adventures.